Well, hello everybody. This is Ralph Fletcher, and this is another session of Writing with Ralph. And I'm glad to have you with me today. Um, we're here to talk about writing. In this case, talk about writing poetry, since it's April and it's National Poetry Month. Although, as I said before, I don't like the idea that poetry should be jammed into or confined into one month. I think poetry is something that happens all year long. Every single month of the year should be a month for poetry. Um, Well, it's great to be together with you guys. You know, some kids have written to me, and some adults too, and they've asked me, well, like, what should I write about? People have been asking for writing ideas for a poem. Somebody said, could you make a suggestion? Another person asked, could you give me a first line? And I could, but I guess I'm more interested in the poem that only you can write, um, that's unique to you, your material. So, I mean, sometimes those kind of ideas come out of a suggestion, but sometimes we have to kind of look inside ourselves. And what I want to emphasize is that every poem we're going to read today, and we're going to read a bunch of different poems, every poem I read today could trigger an idea for you to write about. So, when I read something, you might say to yourself, I can write something like that also. So, I want you to kind of listen to the poems, but and listen to what the poems are about and how they're put together, but also be thinking about, does this poem suggest something that I might try myself in my own writing? All right, so we've been starting our time together by reading some short pieces of writing, and in the sense of playfulness, I'm going to read a poem from this book, A Writing Kind of Day, and it's a poem called Hungry for Poetry. And to write this poem, one of the first things I did was I just listed all the different forms of poetry, and I had some fun playing around with them, as you'll see. Um, Hungry for Poetry. First of all, I saw him chew a tender Japanese haiku. He ate a foot-long sonnet with mustard spread upon it. He downed a bag of ripe canes while walking in the pouring rain. He gulped an epic, chomped an ode, wolfed a couplet to cure his cold. He munched so many limericks they made him absolutely sick. He tried a plate of fresh free verse, but all that did was make things worse. He took some onomatopoeia to cure a case of diarrhea. He ate a poem of 16 lines, and after that, he felt just fine. Hungry for poetry. And it's always fun if you can get a word like diarrhea in a poem, and make it kind of rhyme with something, which was fun to do there. Okay. Um, and I thought I'd read you guys one more from this book. This is sometimes people don't realize that when you write poetry, oftentimes you include facts, information about the world. And so this is a poem called Ma, short for mother or mom, mama. So it's just called Ma. And it goes like this. Ma. Salmon hatch in a stream, swim out to the ocean, but they always return to the stream of their birth. Today I said, bye, Ma, and I got a funny feeling. Then it hit me. Ma was my first word, as if the word swam back to where it all began. All right. And I'm going to read you one more poem. And we've been reading a lot of poems for maybe younger kids, so I've been trying to include some for some older kids. This is a poem from my book, I Am Wings, Poems About Love. I had this really amazing experience where I just woke up in the morning with all these poems in my head. And it's like I was touched by the muse. I keep waiting for this to happen again, but I sat down, I wrote them, and they all came out pretty well in about 2 weeks. This is a poem about, well, you'll see. It's called Playing with Fire. And it's not a rhyming poem. Playing with Fire. You said you loved me that afternoon behind the woodpile, but when your father collapsed at work and died without a hint, without a goodbye, your face got all blurry gray, and I knew enough to stay away. All winter your ma burned the wood he had stacked in the garage to keep you warm, the wood so dry it burned without smoke until all the wood was gone. You said you loved me, but when I saw your face, I understood we were just playing with that word. That's playing with fire. And, it's interesting. One of the giants in my field, Don Graves, lived in my town here. And he was moving from Durham up to Jackson, New Hampshire. And he called me up and he said, I've got all this wood and I really can't use it. Would you like it? So I went over to the house, and the wood had been stored inside, and it was really, really dry. And when I burned it, it just was great. It burned without any smoke. It was almost too dry. But I put that in my notebook, that idea of wood that was so dry it burned without smoke, and that became part of the reason for that poem and kind of one of the details in that poem. Okay, so and we also have been talking about we've been talking about the importance of writing small, and I just want to remind you to do that when you can write, to try to really look closely at something. I was just looking outside. I found a chrysalis, a monarch butterfly chrysalis that had actually um, been where a monarch had hatched last fall. And what I did was I just left it there. It was attached to the side of our garage, and it stayed there all winter with the snow and the wind and then the rain, and it's just so tenacious. It's in some ways it's very delicate, but um, it's also really tenacious and durable. And watching that thing, looking at it, how translucent it is, how the light can go through it. That's a poem idea. I could write that in my notebook and maybe do something with that. Maybe there's a time in my life when I had to sort of climb out of a shell to become something else. Um, so I just want to remind you that it's your job to keep your eyes wide open, to really pay attention to things. And if you find something that really strikes you in some way, put that in your writer's notebook, maybe do an entry about it, and possibly see if it's like a seed for a poem or a story that you could write. And speaking of the writer's notebooks, we've been talking a lot about them in our time together. And I just wanted to show you guys a couple things here in my notebook. Um, one of my favorite poets is Adrienne Rich. And look at this poem that she wrote over here uh, about a swan that's shaped like a swan. I just love that. So I printed it out and then I cut it out and I taped it into my notebook. Um, I like to collect things, and I like to use my notebook as a scrapbook. And if I find something that's really moving, I want to pay attention to it. But the other thing I want to share with you is that I do a lot of listing in my notebook. This is one of the other things you can do in your notebook, because I think sometimes we talk about elaboration, like you can take an idea and then sort of say what you could say more about it. And one of the ways to elaborate an idea is to just think of all the ideas that are connected to it. So, for example, I was thinking about writing some poems about sports equipment. That seems like a weird idea, but look I was just making a list in my notebook. Football poem ideas, baseball poems ideas, and I was just listing all the things that I could write about. And I find that like those kind of lists are very generative. Like when I write about one thing, I think about something else. And then each of these ideas could be a poem. And if I could write, I don't know, 20 or 30 poems, I've got the idea of that kind of the core of a book idea. So it's something that you might think about yourself um, in your writer's notebook. And I did that a couple more times here. I want to show you guys. Let's see here. Yeah, I was thinking about writing a poem about things I'm afraid of, and so I've been like listing poems about fears. When I was a little kid, I was terrified of the vacuum cleaner. Number two, I used to think there was somebody living under my bed, alive or dead. I wasn't sure, but I'd have to use the bathroom, and I'd say, "Mom, I got to use the bathroom." And she'd say, "Well, just go." And I'd say, "Yeah, but what about the guy living under my bed?" She'd say, "There's nobody living under your bed." But you see, each of these ideas could be a poem. And if I can, again, write about 10, well, actually, I probably need about 2 dozen or maybe even 30 poems, but those could be the core of a book of poems about scary things. And see, I might even have one more example over here from my notebook. This notebook here um, is, yeah. So one of the people I've learned a lot about poetry from is my friend Georgia Hurd. I just think that she's a wonderful poet and a wonderful teacher of poetry. And one of her students wrote a poem called "Who Works in the Sun in the Sunset Department," and so I started thinking about maybe you could do a whole series of poems like that. So look what I've done here. I've made a whole list of who works in the firefly department, who works in the tide pool department, and maybe these could each become a poem. But I would recommend that you try that yourself. Like use your notebook as a way to list, and it's kind of funny because what you do, it's kind of a paradox in a way. Because when you're keeping a notebook, you want to list and expand your ideas, but at the same time, you want to like, then when you've got a lot of stuff expanded, and then you're going to have to go back and you're going to have to winnow it down and sort of pick out the best things. So there's two parts, like you expand and then you kind of focus. And you've got to be then, not everything that you write in your notebook is going to be great. Not all those poem ideas will actually turn into a poem. Okay, so let's talk about poetry. And I'm going to give you two tips today, two things to think about as you write poetry. And the first is the issue of tension. Um, I think sometimes a piece of writing kind of like doesn't have tension in it, and those poems or stories that don't have tension, they don't quite work. There's something kind of missing in them. And so in my book here, Ordinary Things, Poems from a Walk in Early Spring, I wrote a poem called Maple Syrup Buckets. And of course, I live in New Hampshire, where many people are tapping trees around this time of the year. And you probably know this. One of the things I learned, which I thought was interesting, is that the stuff, the sap that comes out of the tree that we collect, um, is very watery, and you've got to boil it down to make it sweet. It takes 40 gallons of sap to make 1 gallon of syrup, which is why it's so darn expensive. So this is a poem called Maple Syrup Buckets. And see if you can notice the tension in this poem. Maple syrup buckets. And the illustrator did a nice job of showing that on the tree there, the bucket and the tap. At the edge of Mr. Wells' woods, I count 18 rusty buckets hanging from maple trees. In these parts, it's a known fact that Mr. Wells has never smiled, in fact, hardly speaks at all, though he once explained to me why it takes 40 gallons of sap to make a single gallon of syrup, which made me wonder if maybe he requires 40 hours of silence to make a single hour of talk. He keeps bees, too, succulent honey. Strange that such a sour man should produce all that sweetness. He keeps bees, too, succulent honey. Strange that such a sour man should produce all that sweetness. And you can see there that you've got two things kind of pulling at each other. You've got the sourness of the man, but the fact that he's making maple syrup and even honey from bees. And those two things kind of make the poem, they kind of pull in a creative way that makes the poem interesting. So when you read a poem, ask yourself, do you have tension in the poem? It's one of the things you can look back at. Is there something that creates a little sense of tension in the poem? And then the other thing I'd like you to think about, and these are just quick little tips, but I think they're really important. And okay, so in school, I bet your teacher, you've heard your teacher talk about the importance of the lead to really grab that reader and grab that reader's attention and pull the reader into the story of what you're writing. And she's right, or he's right. Those leads are important. But you know something? In a poem, it actually more important than the lead is the ending of the poem, the last line of the poem. Because if you think about it, the last line of the poem is the part that's going to echo in the ear of the reader. So what I think that you want to do is you want to try to find a way to end strong. And I thought I'd read just a couple of things that do that, I think. This is from my book, Relatively Speaking. And This is a poem called Family Photo. When you get all the family reunion, you get everybody together for a big picture. Family photo. One last picture before we head off in different directions. One last shot. I'm sorry. I'll start again. One last picture before we head off in different directions. One last group shot of all of us smirking with rabbit ears. 3 generations, kids on shoulders, a baby cousin on my lap, and in the middle, Grandma and Grandpa, who started all this. We're all ripples in a pond, spreading out from a stone they threw. We're all ripples in a pond, spreading out from a stone they threw. And you can see the way that poem's put together. Basically, I'm just describing everybody getting together in kind of like, in kind of a casual way. But then I ended it with that metaphor comparing, the stone to a family. And I think that that's really important to try to end strong. And I did that in the poem that I read earlier, New Baby. And I know some of you haven't watched all of these sessions, so you might not have heard this. But this is a poem about when you gather together and the baby's been born. Everybody starts talking about how a certain physical look of the baby resembles somebody from the family already. They start, well, you'll see. New Baby. As soon as the baby gets born, before she's 2 hours old, people start dividing her up. She's got daddy's big ears, got grandma's double chin. She has my olive eyes, like she's just a bunch of borrowed parts stitched together. Well, I just got to hold her. I touched her perfect head, and I'll tell you this, my sister is whole. So, ending strong. And what does that really mean for you as a writer? Well, I'm going to give you a simple technique that you ought to consider. Now, this doesn't always work, but it's something to really consider. What I would do is when you write your poem, you've written a draft of it, then read it over again and put a star next to your best line. Put a star next to your strongest line. And if there's a way that you could end on that really good line, try doing that. Because a lot of times we have a great line, but it's sort of in the middle of the poem and then it kind of gets buried so that by the time the poem's over, you've kind of lost the energy of that line. So I would say start that line, rewrite the poem. And I mean, I don't want to be formulaic, but oftentimes if there's a way that you can end with that strong line, it's a really great way to make the poem work and make that line echo in the ear of the reader. Okay, so I want to now give you something to think about. I mean, as I said earlier, all the poems in this piece of writing in the session could be something that you could use as a trigger for your own ideas. But one of the ideas I want you to think about is writing through a mask, where you actually take something in the natural world and you become that thing. Like, I am the grass. I am the new moon. I am the coronavirus. I mean, you could become something out there, and then you pretend, just like you did as a kid. You pretend that you're that thing, and then you sort of speak as if you're that thing. And it's a powerful tool in writing. I wrote a poem called "I Dreamed I Was a River," and I'll just read that poem. And I might use my glasses because the font is kind of small here. I dreamed I was a river. I dreamed I was a river, now swift running and dangerous, now slow lazing and silted, my toes 1,000 tributaries trickling down from mountain snows, my body fixed yet changing, stretching across continents, my mouth wide open to the ocean. I dreamed I was a drop of sweat on a quarterback's determined brow. I dreamed myself an iceberg, an enormous movable mass, home to walrus, seal, Arctic tern, feared by warships and dog sledders, my huge underbelly never seen by the eye of the sun. I dreamed I was a raindrop falling on a drought-scarred field. I dreamed myself a water creature, my ancestors all ocean-born, my body 3/4 salt water, alive on the only known water planet. I dreamed I was a tear in a grown man's eye. Okay, so if you're thinking about writing poetry and you want to try that yourself, consider writing to a mask. picking something that you're kind of intrigued by in the world. Um, I was just looking yesterday at a piece of a glass plate that I cooked some brownies in. I was just thinking how amazing glass is. That it's strong. We can see through it. You can cook through it sometimes. Cook it. And maybe I could write a poem about that. So um, that's an idea for you to think about writing about today. And as I've said before, I'm always interested in reading your poetry um, or your writing. So this is my email address, figpudding@gmail.com. Um, if you've got your parents' permission, please send me what you write. Or if there's an adult that would like to send me something, I'd be eager to read it. So that's our time together, and I have enjoyed talking to you guys, and hope that I've given you some ideas so that you can take your poems and make them even stronger and really say what you want to say. So thank you very much. Happy writing, and have a good day. Have a good day. I'll be back again next week. In about 1 week from now, we'll have another session of Writing with Ralph. Thanks very much. Bye.